Anyway, so over the last, I'd say, 3-4 years in Washington, there's been this growing concern that we need to do something vis-a-vis China. And I'll go through a little bit of the history of that, kind of why it took so long. But essentially now there's a bipartisan consensus in Washington that China poses a severe economic threat to America. Now, I'm going to leave out, I don't do military policy, I don't do national intel. So I mean, I can talk a little bit about that. There's certainly a consensus on that as well, that China poses a threat, particularly in the South China Sea. But I'm only going to really talk about economics. And most of that is really related to manufacturing, advanced manufacturing. We have a company here in Peoria that we all know, Caterpillar. But it's not just traditional manufacturing, it's things like aerospace, drugs, a wide variety, and then advanced software and things like that. Okay, so let's start off just by saying a little bit about kind of where have we been. For those of you who are older, you remember this. We lived through that. The post-war period, we were number one. We were dominant. This is the GM headquarters. We didn't, in fact, during the 50s, the State Department and the US government had a policy to encourage imports. Think about that. We don't have that policy now. We have a policy to encourage exports. But we thought we were so powerful, so strong. We wanted to help all these other countries, particularly these countries we didn't want to have them go red. Said, well, let's encourage imports so we can help their economies. So the US government, State Department, for example, it helped set up this major technology institute in Taiwan. So if you want to know one of the reasons why Taiwan now is the world's leading semiconductor maker with TSMC, it grew out of a thing called the Taiwan, ITRI, Industrial Technology and Research Institute, ITRI. We set ITRI up in the 60s because we thought we got to help this country because we can't let them be so weak that that red China comes over and Mao takes over. So at the time, it made sense. And okay, that's not something I wrote in green, good. But then again, you probably remember that, it was all looking pretty good, but then late 70s, really through the 80s to the early 90s, there was this big Japan challenge. Japan at one time just, was booming. We all know that. And to some extent, Germany and a couple other countries, but people took it quite seriously. And there was people forget about this, there was a strong bipartisan support for a national competitiveness policy, what you might call an industrial policy. And that's as recently as the 80s and early 90s. And President Reagan and President Bush, I say that because they're Republicans, and now a lot of people in the Republican Party have become essentially free market ideologues. And by that, I mean no government at all. But President Reagan wasn't that. President Reagan supported a program called Semitech, which helped our semiconductor industry. He was an advocate for the research, putting in place what's called the Research and Development Tax Credit. So when a company like Caterpillar invests in research, they get a tax credit for it. He created this National Competitiveness Council that John Young, who was the former CEO of Hewlett Packard, did. So there was this deep bipartisan consensus, and it was one of the parts of it was the 1988 Trade and Competitiveness Act. If you know what Section 301 of the Trade Act is, it was helped through there. It was basically saying we got to have a tougher trade policy to be able to enforce trade laws better, and we have to have a better technology and industrial policy. And it did pretty well. But then what happened is sort of Japan had some problems. One of the big Japanese problems, there's a little phrase in Japan that some of the business people that now know, is called the Galapagos Island Syndrome. So everybody knows the Galapagos Island down off of Chile, and they have these bizarre, crazy species because they just evolve on their own. I mean, that's why Darwin went down there. So Japan decided they were going to have their own technology standards. And so if you went to Japan in '95, their mobile phone system was so much better than ours. I mean, it was crazy. But they ended up completely losing, like not even on the thing, because they picked their own proprietary standards that were only used in Japan. Now, what we picked, what essentially is called Wintel, it's Windows and Intel. And then on top of that was internet standards. With your phone is using internet standards. And we pushed that became the global standard. And so our companies just dominated. And we still have that to some extent advantage today, which I'll talk about. But we started to do so well, particularly in Silicon Valley, also with biotech and the like. And we were like, okay, we're really doing great here. Don't worry about this anymore. We've kind of won. And that became the thinking in Washington. Like, yeah, that Japan thing, they had industrial policy, it didn't work. We're doing great. And that was the view. That was the view that was in place in '99 when the decision essentially to allow China to join the World Trade Organization took place. We're going to let China in the WTO, and they're going to become like us. They got all this stuff they're doing that we don't like, and by joining the WTO, they'll have to change that. And that was widespread consensus that was going to happen. And unfortunately, it didn't happen. So then we went through this period in the early 2000s where you saw significant offshoring of US production to China. Anything I say, by the way, is not at all partisan. I've been appointed by President Bush and President Clinton and President Trump, and so I'm not partisan. But at one point, this is a reflection of how optimistic we were. The Commerce Department under President Bush was going around the country holding workshops for US companies to help them move production to China. You're thinking about that now, you're thinking, what the heck were they smoking? And the answer was, well, you go to China, you're going to cut your costs and you'll outcompete the Japanese or you'll outcompete the Europeans who don't do that. The problem with that strategy is it really didn't work. I was talking to the CEO of a major German company, my group of CEOs, they came by my office and I said, how come you guys don't offshore more to China? And he said, well, we offshore some stuff, but basically it's the stuff that sort of, you have to use hand labor. Everything else, when we have to cut our costs, what we do is we bring our engineers in and our unions, and we say, how do we use technology to drive our costs down so we can be cost competitive with China while keeping production in Germany? So German production, until 6 months ago, so that's what the German economy is a little different thing. The Germans were actually running a trade surplus with the Chinese. And at the same time, the German wages and benefits and all the total compensation package together for their manufacturing workers was 50% higher than ours. So they're paying their people 50% more and they're running a trade surplus with the Chinese. Now, how'd they do that? Well, they did that because they figured out stuff that Chinese couldn't make, like machines and BMWs, and they automated. We actually have one of the lowest rates of robot adoption in our manufacturing of any major country. It's bizarre. You would think the Koreans are using 5 times more robots than we're using in our country. So that's where we were, and now we're in this new stage. We're getting there. And this all began to change sort of at that point. It was like, well, all right, if you're in North Carolina, you got to suck it up. All the furniture factories moved, textile, but we're still good on the good stuff, right? We can still make heavy construction machinery and be dominant there. We can make computer chips, airplanes, etc. So the Chinese will specialize in commodity-based industries, low-wage stuff. We'll stay the high end. China decided they didn't want to do that. They didn't take your economics class. They're like, somehow they missed that week. They're like, hey, low wage, you're supposed to specialize in low skill commodity production. They didn't believe that. So under Xi Jinping, they created this thing called Made in China 2025. And Made in China 2025 was 8 major industries, advanced machining, aerospace, computers. And they said by 2025, and they set numerical targets. So by 2025, they want to have X% of their domestic production, their domestic consumption by domestic production. And they have over 200 specific technology sector plans. So I looked it up the other day. They actually have a very, very detailed plan just on heavy construction equipment. So they basically have a plan on what Caterpillar is doing. They have a plan. They brought all the companies together. They do all that. So I'll talk about that a little bit. So what did we do? That's where we are today. And President Trump, there are lots of things you can say you don't like about him. But one of the things he did do, I thought that was good, was he did raise this issue in a new way. The old consensus was that China is just a, it'll all work out. And what Trump administration did is say, wait a minute, it's not. We wrote in 2010, we wrote a report, which I think you can guess what it meant by the title, which was Enough is Enough, Confronting Chinese Innovation Mercantilism. And what we said is, look, we're free traders, we're globalists, we love that, but that's not what China's doing. And so in a lot of ways, what China has done, when people say, why don't Americans trust globalization as much as they used to? They still trust it, but not as much. And the answer is because China perverted it. We have little spats with the Canadians, about plywood, butter, milk, but fundamentally, we're all in good things. So what did Congress do? Congress essentially said, there's a big debate now in Washington. And one of the debates is, remember that great Miller beer commercial with the football players, tastes great, less filling. So the debate in Washington is slow them down versus speed us up. So the slow us down camp was pretty much Trump administration. Let's figure out ways to slow them down. The speed us up camp, a little bit more on the Democratic side. Well, can't really do much about them, but let's speed us up. In other words, let's make us more competitive. And that's what you see now with the Chips and Science Act, which was just passed and signed by the president, I don't know, a month ago. I was on vacation. I got invited to the White House, couldn't make it, but they'd signed the bill. So what was that all about? That was essentially an effort started by Democratic leader Schumer in the Senate, and we got to do something on that. So he started to work with a Republican, actually our co-chair in Indiana, Senator Todd Young. And they started sitting down and they really said they wanted to do a couple of things. And one was they wanted to make sure more of the federal, but by the way, one of the things they wanted to do is increase federal support for science and research. In 1964, the United States government spent more on research than every other country combined, business and government. To take every government around the world, put all the money in a pot, take every corporation outside the US, put all of their R&D in a pot, the US government was spending more. So if you want to know why we were leading so much, that was why. That was NASA, that was the race with the Soviets. So anyway, that money's gone down. We're about 140 billion short of where we should be a year. So it was all right, we got to spend more money, but we also need to spend the money on focus, not just on whatever. So they said, let's identify 10 key technologies. So the technologies include things like quantum computing, really important breakthrough in computing technology that if the Chinese win, it's a big deal, it's a game changer. Materials like nanotechnology, semiconductors, biotechnology, robotics, and AI, artificial. Those are the main ones. So they put this all together, and there was a big amalgam of political compromise, which is what Washington is about. It's the nature of the game. You got 100 senators in each. So one of the things, you got a lot of senators from states like Illinois that have federal labs. And so one of the first compromises was, well, let's take some of that money and put it in the federal labs. So that picked up easy 10 votes. But overall. Well, exactly. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying there were a whole lot of compromises to get to this thing. And then on a parallel path, there were a number of members of Congress who said, wow, there's this really scary thing going on, which is the island of Taiwan has 70% of production of computer chips that have a basically what's called a spacing between the etching of 6 nanometers or less. I showed my daughter a thing of what is a nanometer, and 6 nanometers is if you had a person standing at the base of the Empire State Building, that would be 6 nanometers compared to a human hair. So human hair, the width of a human hair is the Empire State Building, 6 nanometers is a person. In other words, really small. I have no idea how small it is, but it's 6 of those things. In other words, the point being, this is the most advanced chip making in the world. And the reason it's good is the smaller the nanometers, the more powerful the chip, the more you can do AI, the more you can do all these things. The Chinese can make 30 nanometer chips. These are 2 generations old. So anyway, the problem is most of the world's production is on that little island. And if the Chinese take it over and there's a war and there's bombing, you could lose all that. There's a recent study that suggested if the Chinese do attack Taiwan and that production goes out of circulation, at least for a while, we're talking about 10% reduction in global GDP minimum. So, the latest one we've had with supply chains, which was about computer chips, you can't buy a car kind of thing. That was a very, very small impact compared to what would happen if Taiwan were to be taken over. Now, the other problem was the US military relies on advanced chips for, you think about those weapons that are over in Ukraine, those things that can go from here 40 miles and hit the table, in the middle of the table, advanced chips. And so the military knows that they cannot be dependent on China. So if we go to war, we can't be dependent upon Taiwan. So that was the CHIPS Act. And so what the CHIPS Act was, anyway, and then those 2 things got merged together into this massive package. So what the CHIPS Act does is it says, okay, it does 3 things. One, it says, hey, if you look at the reason why very few companies, whether it's American companies like Intel or foreign companies like Samsung, invest in US factories, what are called fabs, fabrication facilities. In 1980, the US made 40% of all the world's semiconductors on our soil, and now we make 12. So why is that? The answer is that it costs less to do it overseas. But why does it cost less? About 70% of the cost differential comes from government subsidies. So this is not low-wage labor. There are very few workers in a chip factory. It's just pure government subsidies. We'll give you free land. We'll give you massive tax breaks. We'll even give you grants. So what the CHIPS Act does is it allocates something like 40 billion or so, 42 billion, just purely for subsidies. And ideally, they're going to be matched by state governments. So the idea would be, hey, Samsung, Intel, Micron, IBM, you want to build a chip factory, build it in the US. So for example, Intel is announced a big chip factory near Columbus, Ohio, they're going to build. Because of the CHIPS Act, that factory will be doubled in size now. So we're probably looking at $150 billion of semiconductor investment in the next 5 to 10 years in the US because of that. So that's number one. Number two, on top of that is a 35% tax credit. So if you build a chip factory, you got to put real heavy duty, expensive machines in there. These machines cost upwards of $100 million per machine. So these are expensive things. You're talking about building one, you're talking, 25, 50 machines in there. So there's a 35% tax credit for that. And then on top of that, there's about a $14 billion allocation for advanced research and development, going to universities and in consort with companies to work on the next generation of chips. So we don't even know what those are. It could be using things like optical technology or even biologicals, who knows? Okay. So, let's see here. This does not seem to work. The mouse is there. The mouse doesn't seem to.
Oh, yeah, don't, yeah.
Don't use that.
Challenges.
No, it didn't work.
Yeah.
Okay,
The next.
so I want to talk a little bit about okay, well, that's all this stuff we're doing, but do we need to do it? And there's a lot of people in Washington, or some that say, no, we're doing fine. Well, we're doing fine. Don't worry about it. There's a very famous line by Michael Boskin, who was President George Herbert Walker Bush's economic advisor. And if you remember the '92 election, Clinton and Gore went out to Silicon Valley, and they got basically all of Silicon Valley to support them. They were what used to be called Atari Democrats. They were going to be high-tech Democrats. And they didn't vote, they wouldn't support Republicans. And one of the reasons they didn't support Republicans is because Michael Boskin, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, shortly before that was saying, computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? And he said that because if you're an economist, a traditional economist, a dollar of one is a dollar of the other. They're equal because in the market economy, a dollar of something equals a dollar of something else. Well, we can surely show that that's wrong. So where are we? One of the things I think, so this is kind of how competitive the US is going to be or is. This is 1988 to, and this is basically what all this bar is. It says, look at the productivity of manufacturing in 1 year, so how much it changed, relative to the productivity of the overall economy. So what does productivity mean? Productivity means how much GDP do we produce per hour of work in the economy? So the reason why we're richer than other countries is because we have higher productivity. What you see here is that for basically the entire post-war period, you don't see it going back that far, but it's there, until really around 2010 or the Great Recession, US manufacturing productivity was always outperforming the rest of the economy. And if we hadn't been doing that, our cost problems would have been even worse, because the way you reduce costs without cutting labor wages is by raising productivity. But now you can see that pretty much something happened here. US manufacturing productivity is now growing more slowly than the rest of the economy's productivity. So that's troubling. Secondly, I mentioned robot adoption. Here we are, compared to essentially an average. You can see Korea, Singapore, Thailand, China. These are, by the way, I won't go into the details. These are controlling for labor costs and all, but point being, we should be adopting a lot more robots. That's how one way we're going to be able to be productive. I should have worn my t-shirt. I'm visiting my brother. I brought my t-shirt. It has a big American flag, and it said, this t-shirt was made in America by robots. It's a great t-shirt. So this is a recent study we did using the latest data from the OECD, Organization of Economic Development and Cooperation. And it's a little complicated, but let me just sort of quickly explain it. We looked at 7 advanced industries, things like aerospace, semiconductors, automobile production, machine tools, heavy equipment, pharmaceutical production, and the like. And this is what this is basically how much global market share does each country. So we have about 23% of global market share of advanced industries. So you can think all the advanced industries in the world, we have 23% of them. China is pretty close. This is the EU, not counting Germany. And then this is a measure which is on the vertical axis, is a measure economists call location quotient. What does that mean? That means if you look at the, let's just say automobile production, let's just say that global averages, the world is 4% of the global economy is accounted for by auto production. And let's just say our auto production is 8%, we would have a location quotient of 2. We would have double the amount of auto production. If our auto production was 2%, we would have a location quotient of 50% because it's half. So it's just basically a measure of sort of how much of this you have relative to everybody else, what they have. And what you see is kind of a mixed performance. So here, if you look at motor vehicles, we've gone down in, we've gotten less concentrated. We're below the global average in the amount of motor vehicle production we have in the US. We're way below global average in electrical equipment. We're, kind of below with machinery and equipment. Where we're doing okay is this is basically Google and Microsoft, if you think about it that way. IT and IT services and software, we're doing well. This is basically Boeing, aerospace, and now this is 2018 before the Boeing problems. Hopefully that will stay strong, and then pharmaceuticals. Okay, but overall, we're not doing very well. If you take out software, if you take out Google, if you take out Microsoft, those kind of companies, and you just look at sort of hard industry, we have a location quotient of what's called of 0.8. So that means that we're below the global average of producing these advanced industries. Mexico is ahead of us. Just again, looking at this is motor vehicles. China, look at how much bigger the China motor vehicle industry is. And we're down here, Canada's there, Germany, 3 times more motor vehicle production than the global average, about almost 4 times more than we have. Machinery and equipment, look at China, massive dominance in machinery and equipment. Germany, Japan is great on machinery and equipment. Korea, they're a smaller country, but they're, again, if you think about the vertical, sort of how concentrated they are. Even computers and electronic components, look at Korea. So 8 times more than the global average. And that's Samsung, that's SK Hynix, computer chips, etc. Taiwan, massive amounts of this stuff. Now they're smaller economies. So again, the US is not doing very well here. So anyway, I could go into more detail. I won't do that unless you want more. But the bottom line is we still have some strengths, aerospace being one. Biopharma, but even in biopharma, most of that is advanced research and development. A lot of production has left the US in biotech drugs that you inject and other drug pharmaceuticals that you take as a pill. We import but 70% of what are called active pharmaceutical ingredients, or the ingredients that go into drugs, half of those come from China. So there's some real challenges that we face. Now, the last challenge here is really goes back to China. And there's a debate now in Washington, China has these problems, supposedly. They have, there's a good YouTube video of them blowing up apartment buildings where they build these apartments in the middle of nowhere and they have to blow them up. And, that to them is like a rounding error. They don't care. Yeah. I was over there meeting one time with the head of policy for what's called the NDRC, National Development Resources Commission, sort of the major state planning and economic body. And I was talking to him about, their planning and stuff. He goes, yeah, well, in China, we've had to experience a number of tragedies. And I thought he meant earthquakes or stuff like that. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, we decided that we were going to dominate the VCR industry. So we subsidized the production, like a whole bunch of VCR factories, and we were ready to go. And then we went to DVDs. He called that a tragedy. I'd call it sort of stupidity, but he called it a tragedy. Point being, that's a rounding error to those folks. Yeah, okay, we blew that amount of money. Let's go blow some more money somewhere else. And a lot of that money isn't wasted. It's spent on big companies. So China has a very clear game plan, and they apply it to every industry they want to dominate. And it's very simple. It's acquire foreign technology by any means. They do not have, they're getting better, but in advanced energy, they still are laggards on technology and on capability. So they do very aggressive forced tech transfer. If you're an American company and you want to do business in China, you have to give them your technology. Now you can resist a little bit, you can give them bad stuff, but increasingly they're asking for better and better stuff. And you can say, well, I don't want to do that. And they'll say, that's fine.
Oh.
Goodbye. Good luck. Oh, next, Japan. Let's have a little conversation. So it's a hard decision to say no to. It's a little bit like in The Godfather. It's an offer that you can't refuse. Secondly, once they get this technology, and part of that is by foreign direct investment. So they really wanted companies to come in and invest. Once they sort of start figuring it out in their own domestic champions, you get the boot. And the market's starting to shift over to almost all Chinese. Now, that's not in every industry. It depends on the where, but you see it in telecom equipment. In 1990, telecom equipment in China was almost 90% foreign. And today it's 4.5% to 5% foreign. And that 4.5% to 5% is not because of the market. It's the government said, we have to, hey, China Mobile, you got to buy a few pieces of equipment from Ericsson and Nokia, because if you don't, it will make us look like we're protectionist and it'll not give us leverage. So it's allocated markets. You got to understand that. Then once the Chinese firms get better, they do what's called going out. So they're not content with having just the Chinese market. They want to go out and dominate other markets. Now, we don't see that very much here. We saw it a little bit with Huawei, where Huawei started to get inroads into our telecommunications, particularly in rural, smaller telcos. But we don't really see it because they kind of go through the soft underbelly. So if you go to Latin America, you will see Chinese companies up the wazoo. If you go to the Kazakhstan, the stands, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, if you go to Africa, if you go to Eastern Europe, you'll see a lot of Chinese companies. They're not in Japan very much. They're not in Korea. They're not in sort of main old Europe as much, but that's sort of their beachhead is to go in there. And then increasingly to focus on higher value added segments. So I wanted to use this one example real quickly, because here we are in Peoria, where you have Caterpillar. If I were Caterpillar, I would be worried, because you can see this pattern in industry after industry. So you've seen it in high-speed rail. You've seen it in solar panels. In 2000, the US produced 55% of the solar panels in the world. China produced 5%. They produce 65% now. We produce 5%. So you see it in industry after industry where they go through this pattern. And one of their new industries in the last 5 years that they're focusing extensively on is heavy-duty construction equipment. So exactly what Caterpillar makes. So one of their leading competitors there is a company called XCMG. This is a state-owned company. So why does that matter? That matters because they don't have to make profits. Imagine if Caterpillar didn't have to make, Caterpillar's profits are around 12, 14% a year. And if they're any less, their stock goes in the tank. You know, American company, you have to have 10, 12% profit otherwise. So they have half the rate of that profit. So think about that. Now you're 6% or half of your profits. Instead of sending them out to the shareholder, you could keep them and you could lower your price. So that's an advantage that this company has. They get, on average, they get $225 million a year from the government in subsidies. So the government's writing a check to this company, XCMG, either directly or indirectly, $225 million. Imagine if the feds were giving Caterpillar $225 million and say, we will pay for an advanced heavy equipment machinery R&D lab for you, Caterpillar. Here's $225 million. Caterpillar would be more competitive. There's 2 other companies there. Oh, by the way, these subsidies account for about 1/3 of their profits. So think about that. That's the size of the subsidies. The other thing is there's several other companies there. 2 of them, one called Sany, the other is Zoomlion. They're basically what are called zombie companies. I don't know if you know what a zombie company is, but a zombie company is they are going along, losing enormous amounts of money, have massive amounts of debt. They have a debt to earnings ratio of 83. And they've been, most financial analysts look at them as these companies are essentially the walking dead. But why are they still walking? Because the government will not let them go out of business. And then the last advantage they have is the Chinese basically say, if you want to have a construction project in China or in Africa or in Kazakhstan, oh, we're going to give you some money, but oh yeah, you got to use Chinese equipment. Well, and Chinese workers, yeah. So that's a huge advantage. I mean, I don't think you can underestimate the advantage that that will give these Chinese companies. And yeah, we're not going to see it right now, but that advantage builds and it builds upon itself. And so every dollar of machinery that they take a sale away from Caterpillar, that's one more dollar they can put into R&D and one less dollar Caterpillar can. Okay. So I think it's an important deal. So what happened? So as I mentioned, Congress has passed this thing, CHIPS science, but there's one other component of the bill that I think is pretty important, and that's a thing called regional innovation hubs. This was actually our idea, so it's the best part of the bill. So it really was our idea. We came up with a report on this, and one of the things we did is we looked at where is the growth of advanced technology jobs around the country. 120% of it was in 5 places. So 120% means that other places lost it. These places got all the gains and then more. We're talking Seattle, Silicon Valley, Boston. I think Research Triangle Park, maybe one of them. So what's happened to the U.S. economy is a much more geographically polarized economy, much different than when we were younger. And I grew up in Chicago, and Chicago was a powerhouse. It was a real powerhouse. You had Motorola, drug company. And I'm not saying Chicago isn't still a good economy, but we've polarized significantly. And so what the Regional Innovation Hub program does is I think it's $6 billion. And basically what regions can do now is there will be a competition that the department, there's a couple of different things. There's a smaller one, which I encourage you to just look at what the Department of Commerce is doing. There's a smaller one, and then there's this bigger one. And even the bigger one actually it's a good program, but it has some set-asides, if you will, for smaller regions. So Peoria is not, it's not Indianapolis, let's say, or it's not Chicago. And what the program is designed to do is support a place for a minimum of 5 years. So it's, we get award, we're going to invest in you for 5 years minimum for you to help grow your technology economy. So that means helping universities or colleges in the region build training programs, education programs, research programs, partnerships with industries, entrepreneurial things, and a whole set of other things. So I'm very excited about that. I think it'll be a really important program. And it will be good for the country because one of the things I think people don't realize is my son lives in Silicon Valley. And I think he pays like $4 million a month for renting a studio apartment. It pays more than I pay for my entire mortgage in Bethesda, Maryland a month. I mean, it is so expensive out there, but these companies still are out there. Point being, the cost of doing business in Indianapolis is essentially the same as the cost of doing business in Shanghai today. So what we've seen is some cost, kind of U.S. costs haven't gone up much, Chinese costs. So what do technology companies do? My son's company, I'm talking about this thing called Farmers Business Network. All these companies, they're going to have what's called a second 2 office strategy. The first one's going to be in Seattle where they're growing, or Boston, or New York, or Silicon Valley. But then they get to a certain size and they're like, yeah, we're not paying these people this much money. We got to have a second office somewhere. And they don't put that in the middle of a cotton field somewhere. They're going to put it in a place where there are a good university, where there's other talented people. And what they do is they'll put it in Bangalore, India, or they'll put it in Shanghai, or they'll put it in Tel Aviv, or they'll put it in Vancouver. Why not put it in Indianapolis? Or why not put it in Champaign? Or why not put it in St. Louis? Why don't they do that? And the reason they don't do it is because why would I be the first one to go there? That's a risky strategy. But if I knew that a lot of other companies were going to make similar investments and the feds were going to come in and help, then it sort of de-risks that, if you will. So anyway, so that's the theory behind that. And we'll see what happens. I would expect within the next, well, quite soon, actually. Again, if you're looking at how to apply to that, look at the Department of Commerce website. They probably under the Economic Development Administration, they should have notices for works that I think they'll start with workshops. Just, hey, here's how this works, and here's what you should think about. So what else is needed? And then I'll just close. One of the things I think we should, what I worry about is Congress tends to have this view of the world where they'll pass some piece of major legislation and they'll say, well, let's move on. We're done with that. We'll come back in 10 years and see how things went. That worked in the old world. It doesn't work now. Right now, it's like we made important progress, and I don't want to diminish that in any way. But there's a lot more we have to do. And so one of the things would be, for example, research and development tax credit that President Reagan championed. At one time, even as late as the mid-90s, we had the most generous R&D tax credit in the world. Now we are 32nd out of 34 major nations. So we need to double the R&D. We need to tell companies, small, big, whatever, you must spend money on R&D. Another proposal we had was to expand it into a knowledge tax credit. So if you invest in training your frontline workers, your factory workers or whatever, you can get a tax credit. We don't do that right now. My other co-chair, Senator Chris Coons from Delaware, is a Democrat. He and a number of other members have proposed a National Industrial Development Bank. I don't know if anybody remembers this from years ago, but Andy Grove, former CEO of Intel, said what we lack in the US is patient capital. We have a great capital system if you're starting up a company, particularly if you're on those tech companies, fantastic. But what we don't have as much as patient capital, somebody who's willing to invest in hard technology. So much of the VC money goes into software, like my son's company. Software is easy to invest in because it doesn't cost a lot of money. You just basically go sign up with an Amazon AWS server and then buy a few laptops and you're off to the races. But hard technology, making things, it's a lot more risky and you need patient capital. So Senator Coons has a proposal for a national industrial bank, a little bit like Ex-Im Bank, but for domestic companies and scale up. Advanced industry R&D. One of the things that we proposed at ITIF during the Obama administration was a thing called the Manufacturing USA Center Program. And then what it is there's 16 of these centers now around the country. There's one in Chicago, forget the name of it, but it's basically focused on smart manufacturing or digital, how manufacturing companies can use sensors and 5G. And so there's 16 of these. There's one on 3D printing in Columbus. There's one on lightweight materials near Detroit. But compared to our competitors, we don't fund them very well. The Chinese have, it's interesting, the first 15 the Chinese have developed, they're developing 45. The first 15 they had were exactly the same as our 15, but funded 10 times more. So I'm not saying we have to fund them 10 times more, but we do need to invest more. I'm proposing we need to have a Super Chips Act. In other words, why are we incenting only semiconductor companies? In my view, if a company wants to build a battery factory here, or they want to build an American company or an allied company, or they want to build an auto factory, we should give them incentives, just like every state does. Illinois does that. I worked for a governor. We did that. Every state does it. And lastly, and I'll stop, I think we have to think differently about China. There's a bill that was actually passed in 1930 by this guy named Smoot. So Senator Smoot of Smoot-Hawley. So there was this 1930 Trade Act, and before everybody freaks out, like, oh my God, how bad it is. It actually had a couple of provisions that were quite good, and one of them was called Section 337, which gives the International Trade Commission power to block imports if they're produced in unfair, anti-competitive conditions or whatever. We hardly ever use it. There's all these little problems with how it's been, but I think we should do that. I'll give you an example. China has basically just through pure subsidy, cyber theft, criminal theft, and forced tech transfer, they've created a company called COMAC, which is a state-owned enterprise, China something Aviation Corporation. And it is building the equivalent of a 737. It has built the equivalent of 737. It's called the C919. It looks exactly like a 737. And it's flying now. And there are order commitments of about 150 planes. There will be no Chinese company in 10 years, I would argue, that will buy a foreign plane. They will all buy COMACs because they're told to buy, as long as COMAC's planes don't drop out of the sky, which who knows, maybe that'll happen. My favorite COMAC story was the engineers there. They did this thing and they put everything together, and the engineer had made a small mistake and he was off by like, half an inch. And it's like, have to do everything from the beginning. If half an inch, it doesn't work. But anyway, they wasted $10 million on that and they got it right, and now they're building this plane. My view is we should never allow that plane to be imported to the United States because it's an illegitimate plane. It would not exist in the market. It wouldn't exist absent industrial subsidies, absent a closed market, it wouldn't exist. Now, there might be Chinese products like, I guess, watch the Super Bowl. There's a Chinese company called Haier, which makes refrigerators and stuff like that. And I have no idea whether they're getting subsidies or not a massive subsidy. Or maybe they're just a good company, a good private company in China. In that case, fine. Import all you want. But for companies that are, in my view, illegitimate because their only reason they're there is they're propped up by the government and forced tech transfer, I think we should just say no. But we'll see what happens. And that's the big question. Can we finish the job? Here's my, to close on a negative note, which I like to do, because I have to live with this reality and I don't see why I should be the only one. Here's why I think it could be hard. Number one, there are a lot of people now in the Democratic Party who just simply don't like corporations. They just think they're too big, they're too powerful, they got too much money, and we can sort of run our economy on small businesses. Well, dream on, because small businesses, as important as they are, you can't compete with the Chinese on a bunch of 20-person companies. So we have to have the Caterpillars of the world. We have to have the Boeings of the world. A lot of people in the Democratic Party are skeptical now of that proposition. And on the Republican side, you have a lot of members who are like, this is industrial welfare, this is big government, this is industrial policy. We don't want to do that. Let's let the free market work. I'd be the first one to say, hey, let the free market work. But you got this country here that doesn't let the free market work. And if you imagine there's two kinds of corporations in the US, there's what are called A Corps, and they're like normal corporations. Then there are B corporations, and they get half of their revenue comes from the government. They're allowed to steal everybody else's, they don't have to comply with patent laws, and they get government procurement assistance. Who do you think is going to win? It's going to be the B Corp. So, and then the last problem is the small problem of unbelievably massive national debt. So I'm really, all you young people, I'm really thankful for you because you're going to be paying my wife and our Social Security payments. So thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, as disgusting as that is, the fact that we're there and I'm imposing on my kids that burden, but the reality is it's there, and the debt is so bad right now, the overall debt. It's going to be hard for Congress to do these big things that we need to do. So I don't mean to sound completely negative. The good news is there's more of a bipartisan consensus that we need to do this. If you were to get an invasion of Taiwan, which when I talked to let's put it, the national security consensus in DC is the odds are very high by 2034, if not 2032, of an invasion. I don't know what we're going to do. We might challenge it, we might not. But if that happens, that's going to wake people up as well. And like, oh, geez, maybe we should do something. So anyway, the good news is there's more of a consensus. We should do something. The bad news is it's just hard to do these things. And we were pretty fortunate that we were able to do this with Chips and Science. So thank you. And I'm happy to take any comments or questions.
If you have a question, I'll bring the microphone to you. And at home, if you guys can't hear it at home, say something so that we figure out what to do to make it work. If I don't screw it up. Okay, Larry's first.
If city or place that wants to get on that CHIPS Act, saying that they want to get some subsidies from it. Let's say a foreign country, which is friendly to us, wants to come in, establish a packaging plant for, well, I'm referring to SK Hynix.
SK Hynix. Yeah.
That's going to be major for auto manufacturing. That's a major economic, internally could help the United States of America.
Sure.
If it were established. If there's a bidding war or something, let's say we wanted to have it around Peoria area or just north of here or something. Geography might be really good north of here for a lot of various reasons, but how would you go about doing that? If you wanted to get S&K Hendricks to
Sure.
establish a plant in the United States and have, let's say, a co-company along with it, like National Intel,
Yeah,
who might have advanced chips.
right.
If they didn't have to establish a full fab, if they could just establish maybe half a fab or whatever, it is, just get a foot in the door
Sure.
in Peoria, Illinois. How would someone go about doing that?
Well, the key to all of this is that it really boils down to your state government. So if imagine that there's a SK says we're thinking about committing $7 billion. What they're going to do is they're going to go around to states and say, hey, Texas, how much can you give us? Illinois, how much can you give us? And Illinois says, we'll give you free Starbucks for the rest of your life. And Texas says, here's $3 billion. It's going to go to Texas. So what I would do if I were the state, I mean, first of all, Peoria can't do anything. Let's be honest. What Peoria could do would be, let me put it this way, if the state is out to lunch, and I don't know anything about Illinois' economics, I'm just saying, if a state were out to lunch, didn't matter what the cities would do, it just isn't going to work. Now, if you have a state that is on the ball, says, yeah, we're willing to make an investment like Ohio did, then what you could do would be to, for example, there's an annual conference of all the semiconductor machine makers, which are also eligible, these $100 million, there's an annual global conference of chip makers. I would go and I would have a booth there, or I would have Illinois have a booth there that says, hey, here we are, Illinois. Here are the 10 reasons you need to put that fab in Illinois. Here's what we'll give you. By the way, we have this great training program. We're going to set up a community college thing. That actually is a really big deal, is the skill level, the ability to get skilled workers to work in the fab. It's a lot harder than people think. So you're going to have to show that you've got the community college or college programs, because some of it's engineers, some of it's technical workers. So there's no reason that you couldn't have a thing here in a fab in Illinois, but the governor, for that to happen, the governor has to make a personal commitment. The governor has to say, yeah, this is my top priority. I'm going to go fly over to Seoul and I'm going to meet with the CEO. I had dinner with the CEO, or I was in a little group with the CEO of SK Hynix, and the governor of Georgia is best friends with him. As is the governor of Tennessee, because they've just put two big, I think it's Tennessee. They put a battery factory in one place and something else, I think a chip thing. So it really boils down to regional leadership and state leadership.
Well, you know. Yeah, microphone's going around.
Yes, very interesting. This evening, very appreciate it. My question is, what in a nutshell is the German model?
Yeah, why are they so successful?
Yeah, how does that work? How does the German model work?
So the German model, I mean, it's a complicated question. I'll give you the short answer. The German model is based upon a couple of things. One is their companies tend to be more heavily bank financed and less worried about short-term returns. So our companies are much more equity, and they have their mind like every day. I mean, I've actually gone into companies where they have the stock ticker in almost every room. Are you joking with me? Like, if you think about why did we lose Lucent? We had the largest and most successful telecommunications company in the world in the year 1999 and 2000. We lost it in part. There are multiple reasons. I wrote a long piece on it, but one of the reasons was Lucent was so focused on keeping its stock price up that when the downturn in the market came, they slashed everybody. Compare that to Ericsson, which is a Swedish company, which was financed by basically this one big rich family, the Wallenbergs, which you might know about, and then this sort of state bank. And they cut a little bit, but they said, you know what, we're just going to have to take losses for 3 years. But when the market comes back, we haven't cut not just fat, we haven't cut the bone and the meat. When the market came back, they were well positioned, and Lucent wasn't. Lucent went business. So anyway, that's one thing. The German companies tend to be debt financed and take a longer term. Secondly, there's a whole big share of German companies that are family owned, what are called Mittelstaats. So they don't even care about stock prices. They're just like, we're, you know, my father or my grandfather, I was talking to one of these companies, the daughter runs the company now. And she's like, yeah, it's been in my family for 3 generations. There's no way I'm going to let this go under. So they're willing to take the long term. The other component is the Germans invest heavily in engineering. So we're like, I believe, the best science country in the world. We have the best scientists, the best entrepreneurs. We're not as good at engineering as the Germans are. The Germans really, really focus on engineering, and we need to beef up our engineering programs, I would argue, here in the US, and engineering technology. They just do that well. And finally, I was at a meeting with a bunch of CEOs, a thing called the Corporate CEO Council, and there was this great panel, and it was like, you know, CEO of this big company, and it was CEO of a big German chemical company, and he goes up there and he goes, well, before we can make any decision, I have to get the sign off of my union. And the American CEOs were like, oh my God, what a hellhole you live in. You know, they just couldn't believe it. Like, I got to get permission of a union? Never, you know, they're like, this is so antithetical. But his point was, he said, the unions there have a stake in the company. Our union management is adversarial. It's like, what can the union get today? They don't care about the long term as much. Their unions are not as adversarial, and they know that they have a stake in the long-term well-being of the company. I think all of those things together play a role. And I don't want to say that we should copy Germany completely, because we have advantages, but the Germans are not, they don't have a good entrepreneurial startup system the way we do. We're really blessed to have that, but we could learn some things from them. And the last point is just they have these things that I talked about, these centered manufacturing centers. We modeled that after them. They've had this program since 1955. Thing called the Fraunhofer Institute. They have 60 of them, industry, government funded. Industries, they get a lot of value out of this. They all work together on these technologies. So that, I think that explains a lot of where Germany is at. You know, we'll see where they go.
Thank you.
Sure.
Alex Sadachko, I'm a finance major.
That's okay.
From what I understand, as far as ethics go in China, the government does have a large hand in private corporations and the information, the technology they get. What are your fears with the United States government working close with private corporations and companies? Looking back to World War II, we owe a lot of that success to working with the Fords and with very close with private companies. In this day and age, what is the concern with working hand in hand and subsidies and stuff like that?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think, you know, one of the problems is people, again, tend to look at this very sort of Manichaean way. There's either the Chinese model where they actually literally have Communist Party officials in companies. You know, I was in one company in Beijing, the big technology company, and I asked the guy this question, a little sensitive, and he looks over at the communist official and he said, I can't answer that. I'm going to let this official do that. And I'm like, can you imagine an American company? Hey, what do you think about this policy? And the guy said, I'm sorry, but I need to let somebody from the Biden administration answer that. I'm never going to have it. So I'm not too worried about that, because I don't think we're never going to do that. And the policies we're talking about are much more about enabling and helping companies. So things like a tax credit for investing in equipment, or a tax credit for investing in R&D. Or these industry university partnerships where industry doesn't have to participate. If they don't want to, they don't have to. But a lot of companies will voluntarily say, yeah, we're going to put up $100,000 to be part of this consortium because it's going to help our bottom line going forward. I had lunch one time with Jeff Inholt, who's the former CEO of GE. You know, he was talking about all this stuff. And I said, Mr. Inholt, you know about this? I just been in Columbus, Ohio. There was this fantastic program there. It used to be called the Edison Welding Institute, but it basically does metal joining and stuff. And they were working on this incredibly great project that was funded by the Army, because the Army needed to figure out ways to have vehicles when there were IEDs so that the metal seams wouldn't separate when the troops were in there. And one of the funders of it was GE. Along with the government and 10 other companies, because GE had similar problems when they were working with metals. And I said, hey, it was a great program. You got, you know, and he's like, I have no idea what that program is. And no, he's the CEO and all that stuff. But so I don't think nobody's really talking about telling companies what to do. The other important thing here is when we're talking about nobody nobody is talking about, well, I should say, the vast majority of them aren't. We're not, when we say, let's have a semiconductor act and Intel's going to be our champion. So forget about IBM, forget about Texas. We don't like them. We're going to go with Intel. That's picking a firm as the winner. Chinese do that. That's not what we're going to do. We will say, look, semiconductor industry is important. Let's help semiconductor firms. We're not going to, the government doesn't know enough to ever pick one firm. What the government does know enough, and this is where I think a lot of the free market people get it wrong. Anybody in their right mind who doesn't think that semiconductors are going to be critical to the future of our country over the next 40 years is clueless. It is going to be everybody who, if you went and you did a survey of the top, 100 people in Washington who think about technology and stuff, semiconductors will be on everybody's 100 list. So that's an easy one. Same thing with quantum computing. Everybody understands that quantum computing is critical to our country. Now there's 4 or 5 different quantum companies. There's all these different quantum technologies, which we study, but quantum annealing. Anybody know what that is? I don't know what it is, but it's something. And there's 10 different things you could do on quantum. We don't know which one is going to work. So what the government's role is to help place some bets. Let's have a quantum consortia. Let's help companies get quantum skills out of the best universities. So I'm not really, I know what you're saying, and it's an important thing to avoid, but I don't really think it's going to happen here.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I'm Aman, and one of the really hot topics in the crypto market right now.
Can you hold the mic?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm Aman, and one of the really hot topic right now is crypto market, and it's directly associated with chip company, because once the crypto market tanked down, the price of Intel, Nvidia, and all those chip companies tanked down too. So like how you see the future and the correlation between that crypto market and the chip companies.
Digital markets, is that what you said?
Crypto.
Crypto. Oh, jeez. Don't get me started. Have you ever bought a tulip bulb? Tulip bulb was a scam in Holland, where the price of tulip bulbs were like, worth like 50 years of income. Crypto is a Ponzi scheme. Let me say, just to be super clear, digital currencies are super important, and we're going to be using digital currencies. But the idea that you would buy a crypto coin or whatever like that as an investment is just dumb. So I don't know if you know this guy, Michael Saylor, but Michael Saylor is the CEO of a company, big technology company in Northern Virginia. Smart guy, but he just got forced out of his company because he put $1 billion or something like that into the company cash into crypto. He got kicked out, his own company. So the reality is, look, crypto is not an investment. And the reason it's not an investment is how possibly could crypto increase in value? Because there's more demand than supply. That's all. So what do? Well, you waste an enormous amount of energy mining another piece of crypto. You make a bunch of money, and then some sucker buys it. So I think the whole thing is just, we keep going through these sort of financial bubbles, and people are looking for the next big thing, and crypto was it. But it's not an investment. Again, to be clear, we're going to be moving to a world of digital cash, and crypto, digital currency is going to be important, but it's not an investment. It'd be like saying, you know what? I just bought a bunch of dollar bills. Oh my God, I paid $400 for each dollar bill. I'm gonna sell it to some guy for $600. So anyway, I hope you didn't invest in crypto. I hope you did and sold before the other, as they say, the greater fool theory.
I'm Greg. I wondered if you could give us a current status about offshore. You mentioned like robotics, Mexico, Thailand. Isn't that more of a result of FDI from American companies or European countries? So they're not doing it on their own. And like the relationship between Apple and Foxconn, to what extent is offshore still occurring, and how is that hampering our economic development?
Sure. So it depends on the country. Mexico is principally, a lot of that is US production. So Ford has production down there and some of the computer companies, et cetera. China is more of a mix. It was a lot of offshore, and it's increasingly indigenous domestic Chinese companies that are gaining share. There's also this very rough ratio of how many jobs were offshoring versus how many were onshoring. And it used to be sort of 10-to-1 offshore in the 2000s. And the recent studies show that it's a little bit more in balance now. So that the big offshoring wave is over. It's more of a trickle rather than a wave. However, this is on our website, itif.org. We just looked at the newest data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they come out with data every year on inward FDI. There's three kinds of inward FDI. There's what's called a greenfield expansion, where SK is building a factory in Georgia. There's an expansion. So, foreign company here and they say, we're going to build a new section of our factory. And then there's acquisition, where they come in and they buy an American company. About 96% of FDI is acquisition now. It's really, really frightening when you think about that. Everybody has this view, America's this great place for investment. It is a great place for investment, but the investment, and I don't mean to say that acquisitions are always bad. Sometimes acquisitions, well, Chinese acquisitions are always bad because they're essentially their extraction of knowledge. They come in here, they buy a company, and they extract the knowledge and send it over to China. Germans don't do that. The Canadians don't do that. There's a lot of synergies. And so I'm not saying that foreign companies that buy American companies is bad, because we buy foreign companies, our companies. But the fact that we don't have very much inward real FDI, greenfield FDI, I think is worrisome. And that's why I think the CHIPS Act can help turn that around, and some other policies. I really think we should have a lot more foreign companies coming in here and building new things, building new facilities. So, but we don't have as much as we should.
Follow up? I'm sorry.
It's up to Angela.
To what extent do you see China's BRI a threat to national security? BRI.
Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, so this is their basically spending a boatload of money in the countries that are sort of land contiguous to them, to the east and somewhat northeast. So I think we have to think about national security in China in a bunch of different ways. One way is just pure military power, where they're, by some estimates, if you use purchasing power parity, their military is bigger than ours right now. There's a big debate about how good it is and all stuff, but they're going up on their military spending a lot faster than we're going up on our military. So there's just a pure military head-to-head competition issue. The second is a global influence competition issue. And that was one where we were like the New York Yankees for many years. We influenced everybody in every place. And now we see that declining. And there was just a study, a European study that came out, and it surveyed, I think, 6 countries in that region. I don't know what they were, but an example would be a country like Indonesia, let's just say. And they said, and what they found was they all wanted to be much more tightly integrated with China economically, but they wanted our national security umbrella shield. Yeah, I'd like that too. But ultimately you can't have that. I hope you can't have it. But that's the reality. China, these countries over there, and when I say over there, I mean Asia, even Latin America, they are making a choice, and they're saying, okay, who do we have to make a bet here. You can't play both sides. You can only do that for so long. You got to make a bet. You got to put your chips on the table. And a lot of them are saying, yeah, China looks like the better bet. There's just more money. There's the market's growing faster, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think that's inevitable, but I think it is, as long as we, don't have a more robust industrial strategy and domestically, and as long as we keep shortchanging our global efforts to support development. I mean, it's tragic. We should be putting a lot of money into development in these other, I would, by the way, I wouldn't put money into any country that steals our technology. You want to steal our technology? We're not giving you any money. That's a controversial issue, by the way, a point of position. But certainly there's a lot of countries that if we made a big effort to tie them into our orbit with much more effective financial assistance for trade and economic growth, I think we can wean them off of the China influence, and I think that's critical for us to do. I don't see that happen. Yeah, a little bit. People are sort of saying we should do a little more, but I just don't see it happening. So, the unfortunate answer, I think the China sphere of influence will continue to grow.
Sorry. So for the future policies that you were like proposing during your slideshow, like such as the tax incentives and the super chips incentives, how would we get those into Congress, especially like as a voter? Do you know?
You could send a note to your congressperson and say, hey, there's this think tank. Here's the report. You should adopt those policies. And if you don't, I'm not voting for you. That'd be good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, I don't mean to be flip about it. The reality is, unfortunately, these tend to not be voting issues to some extent. People vote now increasingly on hot button social issues and, you know, things like that. But I do think that one of the things that Washington political consultants get wrong is I do think that a candidate who campaigns, like if you, and I'm not picking people here, but if you look at J.D. Vance in Ohio as a Republican, and he wrote that book, Hillbilly Elegy, you know, J.D. is very focused on deindustrialization of Ohio, and I want to fix that. Now you can argue that you don't like how he wants to do it, or you do. Well, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I do think that it's an increasingly salient issue for if you came to a voters and they, I think American economic challenge is serious, and here's some things I want to do about it. I do think that's a winning message in my view. So to the extent you go to a candidate forum, just ask the candidate that question. You know, what specifically do you want to do to make sure that our advanced industrial economy is going to outcompete China when I retire in 40, 50 years, that we're the winner. Because it's not at all clear that we're going to be the winner in 40, 50 years. At this point, we're not going to be the winner. We're going to be third place, second place, whatever. And, you know, if you're an American, like, no, we don't accept that. We're number one. So.
We got time for one last question.
Yeah, hi. My question is the long-term versus the short-term view. I mean, China has, from what I understand, a real long-term, like 100-year policy on what they're going to do, when they're going to do it, and specifically. And the United States, it seems to be corporations, politicians, virtually everyone, an entity has short-term.
Right.
So we don't care about the R&D. We don't care if this company lasts or not. We don't care what our employees think, as long as that bottom line right now is good.
Right.
How do you change that culture?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's a book that a colleague of mine, Michael Pillsbury, wrote called The 100-Year Marathon. So, yeah, it's a good book. And Michael's point is the Chinese in 1949, when the revolution happened, which never should have been allowed, by the way, US policy failed, in my opinion. They set a goal that said by 100-year anniversary, we're going to be the dominant hegemon leader in the world. And they're happy to wait 5, 10 years. They don't care. It helps when you have a country that's 3,000 years old. You know, we're still a teenager kind of thing, and we have you know, we have a syndrome of we have to be satisfied now. So look, how do you do it? I think there's a couple big ways. One is I think we have to rethink kind of corporate governance and finance. So, and I'm not enough of an expert there, but I know people talk about, for example, just having the SEC say you don't do quarterly you don't do quarterly reporting, you do it semi-annually. Or you could change the capital gains tax to more reward even longer term things. So there's some things you could do there. This industrial bank would help. So I think that's important. I think a much more important thing is to raise the issue. So again, not being partisan, because I'm not, I do thought it was interesting that Secretary Clinton had this in her campaign in 2016, where she was talking about going to helping to fix what she called quarterly capitalism. And the problem with that, though, is some people on the left say, well, we don't like profits. And there's a very good book by a Northwestern finance professor who says the problem with companies is that they're not maximizing net present value profits. So if you get $100 in 10 years versus $5 now, they'll take the $5 now, not the 100 in 10 years, even though on a net present value with interest rates, the 100 is worth more than the 5. So you want to do that. So I think the most important thing is, frankly, the way the country changes is through who the president is. I mean, that's just where we are today. And I think we need to have a president who raises this as a critical national issue. You remember John F. Kennedy's "Don't ask what you can do for your country, don't ask what your country can do for you." You know, my wife's parents were of that generation. They came to Washington in that era. Her dad worked for the State Department. That meant something to them. I mean, it really meant something to them. It was real. It wasn't just a phrase. And I think we need a president who calls out voters and says, you know what, I understand your short-term pain. I understand that, but most of you have children or grandchildren. And what I'm asking you to do is to give up a little bit now. And I'm asking everybody to give up. I'm going to raise taxes on rich people. But I want everybody to give up a little bit so we can all invest in our future. I mean, you look at the road system in the US, how much money we invest in infrastructure. We used to invest significantly more in infrastructure 40 years ago. And American adults said, yeah, we're willing to do that. We're willing to pay taxes and because we know it's good for our economy. I was down in California and in vacation. And California, under Pat Brown, the government, I mean, they built the world's greatest public university system, the world's best roads, the world's best water system. And it's like nowhere near that now, because they just haven't invested. Because the vote, and everybody says, oh, the politicians are selfish. Politicians respond to voters at the end of the day. They just do, most of them. And so it's going to require, I think, a national coming to terms with where we are. And I don't know whether that's possible. I just don't. But I know that we're not going to change it if we don't try. And I just think, one thing that one thing that frustrates me about corporate CEOs, and I'm not knocking CEOs, but they should be helping to lead that conversation. So they should be one saying, you know what, if you talk to some CEOs, they'll tell you in a private conversation, they'll say, yeah, we're a global CEO, but I still have a commitment to America. I have family here. I want our country to do well. But as a corporate CEO, I'm incented to not worry about that. But personally, I want to worry about that. So I think there are opportunities to do that. So we'll see.
So please join me in thanking Mr. Atkinson.
Thank you, everybody.
On behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, thank you all for joining us tonight. If you're not yet a member, I invite you to join us. There are some brochures out on the table. If you are a member, stay tuned. We've got our big event in September on Ukraine, and I'm happy to draw a close to amateur hour. I'm sorry for all the errors tonight. But thank you all for coming. We'll see you guys in September for the big program on Ukraine. So.